and welcome to this episode of ArtsAbly in Conversation. My name is Diane Collin. I am a woman with short hair, blue eyes, and glasses, and today I wear a black top. Behind me is a dance studio with gray walls, tall mirrors, and spotlights. This series presents artists, academics, and project leaders who dedicate their time and energy to a better accessibility for people with disabilities in the arts. You can find more of these conversations on our website, artsably.com, which is spelled ArtsAbly.com. Today, ArtsAbly is in conversation with Elizabeth McLain, an assistant professor of musicology and director of disability studies at Virginia Tech. You can find the resources mentioned by Elizabeth McLain during this episode on ArtsAbly's website in the blog section. Welcome to this new episode of ArtsAbly in Conversation. Today, I am with Elizabeth McLain, who is Assistant Professor of Musicology and Director of Disability Studies at Virginia Tech. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Thanks. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for taking the time in your busy schedule. I know you're very, very busy.
Yeah, thanks for working around that. I really need to work on my schedule. It's a bit much.
So I always like to know a little bit more about my guests. So I wanted to know a bit about your background, who you are, what made you start in music, things like that. And also if you could provide a visual description. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I am, do I want to say middle-aged? I'm going to say mid-30s, which is pretty close to middle-aged. Cis white woman. I've got medium-length blonde hair that's kind of got messy waves in it, I learned recently, and glasses. And I am sitting in my office with various things associated with tea and Star Wars sitting behind me. Yeah, how I got started in music. I grew up in a family where music was very important, but it wasn't anyone's day job. So all of my family members played brass instruments and they did it just for fun, but I was the first one to want to go to music school and pursue that. I was working on a degree in trumpet performance when more of my disabilities manifested. I'm autistic, but didn't really get a formal diagnosis until my 20s. I also have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which causes all of my joints to dislocate when they want to, among other fun things. And when I was in undergrad, I think my second into my third year, my ribs started dislocating while I was playing trumpet, especially when I was playing piccolo trumpet, which requires just a lot more force. It was very confusing for doctors. They didn't immediately catch that that's what was happening, and it still took, almost another decade to know why it was happening. In fact, if I hadn't gotten the autism diagnosis, I don't know if I would have gotten the diagnosis for Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And these two things seem to both correlate with each other. If you have one, you're more likely to have the other, but also the other way around. So on top of just asthma and other things that were putting pressure on my lungs and on my rib cage, very clearly this became not a viable career path, we'll put it that way. I explored orchestral conducting for a while, which I liked, and I think I was pretty good at. But after going on some auditions, I realized that the path to get there was just odd. It was very much based on personal charisma, and there's a lot of obstacles to navigate. I was kind of used to the sexism from being a trumpet player, where women are still a minority. But yeah, it really did not seem like a viable path in terms of, oh, if I put the work into it, I will end up being able to make a living off of it. It was a lot more confusing than that. And especially with my health kind of falling apart, I didn't know if I could count on it. So I met a professor, his name is Michael Saffel, at Virginia Tech, where I did my undergrad. And he just needed a research assistant to work on a book about Liszt and some letters between Liszt and Degas. And I could kind of step in and help with my background in French. And that's when I learned that I was a musicologist. It just seemed to fit. A lot of the skills that I had, whether it was learning different languages or, I had been also working on a bachelor's in history the whole way along or things like that, everything kind of fell into place. So then I did my graduate work at the University of Michigan, where as I acquired more of a mobility disability side to my chronic health disabilities and really got the name for why my brain was so different and why I was struggling, got that autism diagnosis, I became involved in disability organizing first at kind of the local level, things that I needed to get done at the University of Michigan and bringing the knowledge I had and the knowledge I was gaining every day to the School of Music, well, School of Music, Theater, and Dance. I don't want to forget theater and dance just because I'm not talented in either. But the School of Music, Theater, and Dance at the University of Michigan, Musicology department, and it was, kind of a gradual thing. I was doing a lot more on the activism side than getting into pedagogy. And it took many years before I realized that disability was infiltrating my research. So I came to Virginia Tech in 2019 to be an instructor full time while I was finishing up my dissertation. And that timing will probably ring a lot of bells for folks because then the pandemic hit and everything became a lot trickier. But I finished up and defended my dissertation and graduated in August of 2022. I defended my dissertation, I think it was less than a week before I had major surgery to have a spinal fusion. And I had to do all of my revisions and all of the submission and paperwork and stuff in the first week that I was out of the hospital for that. So it's a bit of a blur, but it's very nice to have it done. I'm very grateful to Mark Clegg and everybody else at Michigan that helped me cross the finish line. So yeah, this year I started as, my new role, as you mentioned, assistant professor of musicology in the School of Performing Arts in the College of Architecture, Arts and Design here at Virginia Tech. But then I'm also director of disability studies in the Academy of Transdisciplinary Studies in the College of Liberal Arts and Human Sciences. That's a lot to say. I did it without notes this time, so I'm very, very proud of myself. But yeah, that's a bit of how I got from where I was to here, I guess.
Yeah, and which explains the busy schedule.
Yes, yeah, I'm straddling, yeah, two colleges, two units, two completely different lives. And frankly, learning about disability studies as I go, like I didn't have access to being able to take classes in disability studies. And that's not unusual. A lot of professors of disability studies have to add this knowledge on after, they're done with their coursework. So I do my best to read one chapter, one article in the realm of disability studies, but also disability activism and arts and all of that, disability culture every day. And I fail a lot of times, but I do succeed a lot of times. And I'm hoping eventually my lived experience is kind of at one level, and I'm hoping like the academic knowledge to talk about it they'll meet soon. That's my hope.
But you're also the co-chair of the Music and Disability Study Group at the American Musicology Society. So I
I
guess,
was until recently. I did step
oh,
down last year, which was a year early, and that's why it looks like I still am. I stepped down a year early because my co-chair, James DeVille, and I had talked about the need for the co-chairs to overlap so that we don't lose two at the same time. And because I had such a busy schedule and so many research projects going, I offered to be the one to step down first. But yeah, I'm really proud of the work that we did there, and it was wonderful to be able to step down and walk away and know that everything I wanted for the group was kind of going to manifest with or without me. Like we'd made several gains, but I could just see the trajectory that we're on. And I think bringing new energy in has been really helpful in continuing that.
this group is really fantastic. It's really a good group of people who really are activists in their fields, try to make things happen, you including, right? So I'm really happy to have been able to work with this group also and with different people from this group. So yeah, I think you can be really proud of what you've accomplished in that.
Yeah, my big goals for the group, I love seeing that they're happening even when I'm on the sidelines, right? Like making sure that we're collaborating with people from different fields, centering the experience of disabled artists, which may sound like a no-brainer, but when you're in this kind of work, it's very common for stuff to kind of slide into music studies of disability, right? Like we're talking about disabled composers or disabled performers or whatever, but we're not really applying a disability studies lens. And a lot of times, maybe the people studying it aren't themselves disabled or aren't in community or don't have that background. And there's a lot of great work that falls into that category that I use every day and I love. It's fantastic work. But I wanted to make sure we were kind of growing the segment of music studies surrounding disability that really was bringing disability studies to the table and trying to find ways in which our academic work could have a real world impact. So yeah, it's been really cool to watch the group do that. I mean, I go on record all the time, so I'm not afraid of doing it here, that I'm very disappointed in the lack of access in our society, in the American Musicological Society. I think we've actually taken some steps backward when it comes to access in recent years. And that's the one thing that I'm nervous about. It's not the future of the group. It's whether people like me can continue to be a part of this society, whether the society will kind of continue to serve us or let us serve them even. Or if one day we end up either needing to strike off on our own or find another organization like the Society for American Music or Ramped or something like that, that we can kind of take this fantastic work to.
Yeah, and recently there has been conversation about someone we know that who is part of a group and who had to step down from presenting because there were a lot of access needs that were not met. And so it's sad. It's
Yeah.
yeah.
Especially when you see a smaller society like the Society for Music Theory offering a significant amount of their programming online, not just for people who have gone through this onerous accommodation process, but for everyone. I mean, I love the curb cut effect, and it's an example of that, right? Where disabled people needed to be able to access the society remotely for presenting and for attending, but doing that also benefited parents of young children who couldn't travel, people who are in employment situations where they're not getting any funding for traveling or they can't get their teaching covered. It ends up helping a wide range of people, including people who are part of our society but can no longer travel to the US with visa restrictions or all sorts of things like that. And the fact that a smaller society like SMT has been able to accomplish it, I feel like that should be an example for AMS. Although when it comes to curb cuts, this is completely off topic, but I'm having a lot of frustrating feelings. This, when we're taping this is a week after the US election. And I was thinking about the fact that when we talk about disability and access, this idea of curb cuts as a metaphor, the fact that when you give disabled people access, many people benefit from it.
Yes.
Coming from, when we've had to retrofit sidewalks to have that little cut in the curb so you can go up there in a wheelchair, well, that's also going to help people pushing around grocery carts or strollers or just all sorts of folks. And the thing that makes me furious about curb cuts is when disabled people fight for them alone. And then they benefit everyone. And then disabled people have to fight to keep them because we're always in danger of losing our access. It's Anita Cameron who reminds everyone you have to fight for your rights and then fight to keep them. You can't let off the pressure. But then on top of that, there are times when, it feels like in the United States, we're gearing up for a lot more fights. We're gearing up to try to keep Medicaid. We're gearing up to try to keep access to our health care, a lot of things that have been threatened. And it's been infuriating to see people I know who benefited from the work disabled activists did, from disability legislation. I mean, everything from caps on insulin to the Americans with Disabilities Act to infrastructure changes like curb cuts. And not only are they not in the fight with us, but they try to tell us everything's going to be okay because they've never had to fight for this thing that they take for granted. So I don't know. When I think about curb cuts, I think about the fact that that should produce more solidarity with disabled people. And instead, too often it's interpreted as, okay, we can give you this cookie because it will also benefit other people. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah, I've been perseverating on it a little bit.
But in a way, so we are both part of an organization called RAMPT that you mentioned briefly.
Mhm.
And RAMPT is doing that work inside the music community. And I wanted to know a little bit about your arrival to RAMPT and your work with people in RAMPT.
Yeah, I came into Ramped. I was not in the founding cohort, but I think fairly quickly, like definitely within the first year. And it was Galen Lee, who's one of the co-founders of Ramped, as you know, who really encouraged me to join. And it's a little interesting. Unlike you, I'm not currently performing as a musician. So at first I thought, well, this isn't quite for me. Like I'm happy to support it, but it's really only for artists. That it really hasn't been the case though. I've had the good fortune at Virginia Tech. My colleague Ashley Shue and I, and some other folks here and at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, received a grant from the Mellon Foundation for what we're calling a Disability Community Technology Center that's really trying to bring disability culture and arts and folks that talk about disability justice to Appalachia. And working with Ramped, it's been fantastic to then be able to connect with artists and start building these residency programs, which have been delayed significantly because we've lacked accessible infrastructure when it comes to venues, especially. So we had to put things on hold and then try to get venue problems fixed and raise funds for that and then find alternate venues. And now we're kind of gearing back up. But it's been really nice developing that project in partnership with all of the folks at Ramped who are doing this work. I've been able to serve mostly on the membership committee. I think I was on PR for a hot minute and then then jumped over to membership, or engagement is what we call it. But a lot of the stuff we're dealing with is membership and then some event planning. Um, had the opportunity to speak to the National Independent Venue Federation a while back, I think almost a year ago now, about trying to improve accessibility for their venues and ways that you can do it even on a low budget. Um, was able to go to the White House with some folks from Ramped. I mean, there have been a lot of terrific opportunities. So much of it is just community building. And I'm hoping that in the coming years, we can build up even more on the side of people who are kind of, behind the line, academics, industry professionals, because I think right now there's a lot of burden on artists to run everything. And that can be really tricky because they have tour schedules and their lives are just a little less predictable than those of us who are fortunate to have more or less a 9 to 5. So I'd like to get a lot more of us represented there.
Yes, and there's a there is a new musicologist also right now who is also a performer, but it's nice to see that we
Yeah,
are more and
absolutely.
more to consider, okay, let's join that and try to work on the connections and the community. Yeah.
Absolutely. Because I think a lot of folks end up feeling like they're alone. We're also pushed to speak on things as experts that we're not 100% experts in. This is something I've only been thinking about a lot in the past year. How often disabled folks go from like diagnosis or realizing they're disabled or identifying as disabled to having to speak for the community and being treated as an expert on accessibility. And then all of the education you might lack while you're trying to do that. And that, like it just kind of, now I'm thinking about the fact that there are a ton of us, right? Like we can specialize. We can share opportunities around. We don't have to carry that alone because that pressure to be like the ambassador for disabled musicians or disability in the arts, or to say that, yes, I can solve all of your accessibility in the arts. I mean, that's how we get burnout.
Mhm.
Whereas Ramped is increasingly, I think, and I hope, helping us see that no one of us has to be an expert on everything. We can work together, we can move together, we can build the world that we want to see together, which
Yes,
is
and
fantastic.
recently Lachi has organized a meeting to explain to pro members what is the social model of disability. What is a possibility of talking about people with disabilities? What are things that we hear in our society all the time and that bother us, but why? And it was a 1 hour conversation. She presented things, and then she launched the conversation, and it was very nice to have that, because that's one, it's important, and two, some people who just joined the community and say, okay, so I'm now part of the big family of musicians or performers with disabilities. Now what?
Exactly. Like just being disabled or being autistic doesn't mean that you know anything. I mean, I've been autistic my whole life. It took me a long time to really understand that. But even after getting a diagnosis, it's like, okay, go on your way. And of course, the person who diagnosed me, it was a horrible process. Um, he just told me to go on the Autism Speaks website. That was the only resource he gave me. That was the only follow-up. And I was moving to France for a research year. To compound it further, I also ended up with an emergency surgery in Roanoke, Virginia, when I was visiting my brother. It was a nightmare time. But I'm just kind of in France by myself, trying to do my archival work and function in a different language. And like, oh yeah, you're also autistic. What on earth does that mean? It wasn't until I came back from France and I joined a support group that I think it was supposed to be very much led by someone at our counseling center at the University of Michigan, but the autistics kind of just took over every single week. Like she was so sweet, she's wonderful. She'd come in and she'd have a plan and an agenda, and she'd distribute poker chips that had a specific meaning. So we had some nonverbal communication. And then we would just do whatever we wanted to do every week. And she let us, like she did let us guide it. So it kind of turned more into like, she has a plan if we don't have one. And then we just kind of took off. Um, but anyway, that's where I met a friend of mine named Luke Kudrashev, who's now at the University of Minnesota as an accessibility specialist. And Luke really brought me in and, helped me understand how to survive as an autistic adult and what I was experiencing and connect me with community, right? And I think when people are trying to learn more about disability, if you're on social media or you're looking at going to a presentation, there's some questions you kind of have to ask yourself. All disabled people can speak about their own experience. That is true. But the minute we go beyond our own experience, you do have to kind of wonder what our credentials are. And it's not just professional training. I mean, I could get a psychology degree, but that doesn't actually mean that I know much about mental health related disabilities. The thing that I'm really interested in is who is in community with other people. Because either I'm speaking about my autistic experience, or I am able to start pointing towards, you should read this person. This person says this. This is how it's different from what I hear to be autistic. And like, there are some great people who are Indigenous and autistic. I learned so much from them on social media. Folks who are Black and autistic parents of autistic kids are like some of my favorites in the universe because they just understand things much more holistically than the rest of us. So yeah, checking out and seeing, is this person in community with other people? Are they reading and referencing other stuff? It's kind of funny because in one sense, okay, yeah, common sense. Of course we know to do that, but on the other, we almost never do, Like it's really tricky. But yeah, that being in community part of RAMPed is really important. And I think the fact that we're continuing to educate each other and learn about these things, yeah, that can only help.
For sure. Well, we talked a little bit about that, but what is it for you? What does it mean for you to be in an environment that promotes accessibility in the arts or disability culture?
The most important thing for me is if disabled people are in charge. I think I used to be a lot more forgiving about this, but now that is almost my bare minimum. Like my armor is up, and I almost assume that I'm not going to be included if I don't see disabled people, not just with a seat at the table, but a position of power. Because a seat at the table without power or agency is tokenism, as Leah Lakshmi Pipajna Samarasinghe tells us in care work. I hope I didn't butcher that. I love them, so I apologize if I did. But that idea is definitely in there. Accessibility for me is not just being able to get into a space, it's being able to have agency and power in that space and being able to transform it. So are they advertising in advance what access they do have? And are they providing a way for you to ask about other access you need? I think that's really important to me. disability culture is something that, like, I have a class called Disability Culture in the Arts that I teach every year. It's very, very important to me. And when I say disability culture, it's important to know it's not a monolith. You're trying to kind of talk about an aggregate, knowing that every individual within it probably doesn't fit whatever definition you come up with, and that we have subcultures based on types of disability, but also on how disability, intersects with things like race and gender, because although ableism and sexism and racism, transphobia, all of these are interlocking and interdependent systems of oppression. They all reinforce each other. They all shape your experiences, right? Like the way I experience ableism as a white autistic woman is going to be different than like a Black trans autistic woman, for example. But disability culture to me, it's about the things that we care about. It's about how we understand ourselves. In some sense, it's the language that we use. I think increasingly values associated with disability justice are playing a bigger and bigger role in how we understand disability culture. Not that everyone's informed on the topic, but a lot of things that are articulated in the principles of disability justice, like interdependence and intersectionality, a lot of these things kind of come out of that culture that we've created. It tends to be a culture that prioritizes care and that understands the value of everyone, no matter what they can and can't contribute. It's still a culture that's problematic and exclusionary because it exists in the framework of other cultures. But I think it's often at its best, it's a space of trust where you don't feel any shame for having needs and where people will help you get those needs met. I think a lot about fictional characters when I teach my students, in part because I don't want to call out real living human beings if I don't have to. I'm going to have to update my references, though, because they're already getting too old. But I think about in Parks and Rec, the character of Ron Swanson, who was like, cutting down a tree and making a canoe and paddling it himself. He still spent this like tiny amount of money, like less than $50 a year, buying clothes because he couldn't make clothes. He was still driving on roads other people had paved, even if he did sometimes step in and fix the potholes for folks. Like we all have needs, and it's fairly arbitrary which ones are acceptable and unacceptable on a social level, right? Which ones get met and which ones don't. I think about the number of life skills that a lot of my friends with intellectual disabilities have, and skills that oftentimes my non-disabled friends, especially my friends who are men, might not have. Like we expect people with intellectual disabilities to be able to cook and clean and take care of their own homes, but grown non-disabled men, that for some reason there's not the same expectation all the time, right? So yeah, I think disability culture is also about exposing that and about challenging that.
Yeah. Yes. And so you mentioned you had you're teaching a class about disability culture, but you're also doing other projects. Can you talk about some of your projects, or at least one that counts right now that you're doing?
Yeah, I'll mention one briefly and then a lot more detail about another. So we're kind of in the middle of putting together an alt text music notation working group. This is going to be really focused on like European American Western art music style notation at first, just because that's the source material and the team that I've been able to put together. I had to pause everything while I bring my graduate student worker up to speed, like getting accessibility certifications to help us make sure all the PDFs are accessible. But we're trying to devise a way to help blind folks access music notation apart from just Braille or just transcribing Braille, because there's some limitations with the current most popular systems of Braille music notation. So that's one thing that if you're interested in and you have time and energy to put into it, would love to hear from you. Can email me directly. I'm easy to find. One of my projects, though, that's quite different and has surprised me because it was basically a footnote in a grant application and now is causing me to write a lot of other grant applications, is called Open the Gates Gaming. This is a project that grew out of a very local need. Here in Southwest Virginia during the pandemic, we had a lot of disabled folks who wanted to play Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons is the most popular tabletop role-playing game in the world. It's not even close. It's a little embarrassing how much of the market share they have. But it exploded in popularity during the pandemic again, thanks to being, shown on television, like with Stranger Things on Netflix, or the fact that you could play it on Zoom, so you didn't have to be in the same room to play, and there were all these digital tools being created, like D&D Beyond and stuff like that, that helped people play it online and helped get players going. But it's also a system that has a huge cognitive load. It's unfortunately a subculture that historically has been quite exclusive. I know as a woman, I didn't get into this hobby for a long time because if I had to go to a gaming store and play with strange men, I was often just subjected to a lot of sexism or shady behavior, and I wasn't included. I think people of color have experienced much worse here. But it also has a lot of progressive, radically inclusive potential. There's no reason that we can't all play together. And it's a game that develops a lot of empathy because you're creating a character and stepping into their shoes for hours, but sometimes years, if not decades. There are games that have been going on for decades, which is wild to think about. So the local disability community wanted to play, and they didn't just want us to create a separate set of rules so they could play by themselves, or to play different games, because there are other games like D&D that are much more cognitively accessible. I mean, Kids on Bikes is wonderful. There's a lot of great systems out there, but they wanted to play this one and they wanted to play it with everybody. They didn't want a segregated table, they wanted an integrated table. So we started developing cognitive access tools to help bridge that gap, initially with a decision guide, because after you sit around a table and after the world is explained to you, the person running the game will look at you and say, well, what do you want to do? And you can do anything. You can say that you want to jump off of a cliff. You can say that you want to open a pottery studio. You can try to seduce a goblin. Like anything you can try to do in this game. But that by itself can actually become an obstacle. So our decision guide was just prompting players, like, here are questions you can ask or things you can think about to kind of help focus them in. We also created spell cards because the magic system is really complicated. So we created easier reference spell cards in larger print that had information presented in a standardized way. And we made a class selector, kind of a tool that helps you build your character, because building the character is often enough to scare people off. It's a huge, complex process with books that have hundreds of pages. So we tried to simplify that and make it storytelling from the beginning. It was so exciting for people that the demand for what we were doing kind of skyrocketed. And once we started trying to implement these 3 tools, we realized we needed other stuff. So now we're making videos that explain concepts in like social media length, right? 90 seconds or less. Here's what the concept is. And here's an example of people actually playing with that concept. They're, multiple actors at a table with the dice, with all the things. We also have a sample adventure now, so you'll be able to watch an entire session so you know what to expect before you go and if you really want to do this. We have ability cards and we also have character sheets. So our group eventually kind of coalesced a couple of years ago around this name, Open the Gates Gaming, because there's another side of it that is creating more inclusive stories. So it's not just like this fantasy realm built around what European cishet able-bodied white men would want. We're trying to open up other realms of storytelling and other possibilities around disability and race and gender and sexual orientation. And the idea for us is that play is a human right, and yet it's something that's denied to a lot of people. We believe that everyone is a storyteller, but not everyone is having the chance to tell their stories, that systems need to be flexible to be accessible. So we're kind of pulling that all together to then create these open access tools. So we are in the last stages of prototype development. We'll be doing play testing in early 2025, and everyone that comes and play tests with us gets free custom dice that have our logo on them. They're very cute. But this will all be open access. We have a website, openthegatesgaming.org. if you mess up and say openthegatesgaming.com, it will redirect you. So just minimal pressure there. And we're on social media, although we're just kind of slowly building those channels. So we'll be releasing stuff as it's ready. Currently, it's all 2014 rules because that's the set we can work with where the free rules are, published and on a Creative Commons license, and we won't upset anybody at Hasbro or Wizards of the Coast. But it's been a really, really cool project because I've been able to see that cognitive accessibility crosses so many barriers. I mean, one of our most popular demographics now, it's parents, people who don't get a lot of time off and a way to just be separate from the kids and do something fun. So they don't want to spend, the whole night just learning some rules, right? They want to get in and play. But we're also seeing a rise in the need for this, even from experienced players after COVID, because long COVID's often has a lot of neurological manifestations. So yeah, we've got things for experienced players and new players, and we have a commitment that it is always going to be open access, free for everyone to use. Our team, everyone in our team has a reason why they would not have been able to get past the gatekeeping, but we've all been able to leverage some aspect of our privilege enough to kind of get inside. So now we're trying to kick open the gates from the inside to let everybody in.
Wow, it's a fascinating project.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's not where I thought I was going to be. I never thought I was going to be doing this. But it's really, really cool.
We will share all these links on
Yeah.
ArtsAbly so that people can have a look. It's great. I also read somewhere that if we want to challenge you with another game, which is the Star Wars game, if we fight with you, we will lose. Is that right?
Probably. I don't know. I mean, there are some people that get really into like the mechanics of the ships that will lose me for a second, but I have been a deeply devoted Star Wars fan from my earliest memories. Yeah. So yeah, no, I love Star Wars. In fact, the very first tabletop role-playing game I played was a Star Wars one. It was the Fantasy Flight Edge of the Empire. Yeah, Star Wars is the best. And I'm one of those I love The Last Jedi. The Last Jedi, this is gonna get you hate, but that's engagement, right? The Last Jedi is one of the best Star Wars movies ever made, and I think people are gonna get there. You got to remember people hated Empire Strikes Back when it came out, and now it's universally held up as one of, if not the best. I think The Last Jedi is the same way. People were disappointed because they had ideas of what it should be, and it wasn't those things. But yeah, no, I love Star Wars and this age of Star Wars storytelling we're getting in. That's far more inclusive, far more people's stories. It's not just Joseph Campbell's monomyth anymore. Yeah, it's a really exciting time. Unfortunately, we can learn a lot from the Andor show. That's all I'm going to say a week after the election.
Sorry, I didn't get that.
Oh, the Andor show it's from like the early days of the rebellion. And yeah, it's got some of the best acting, writing, directing. Like even if you don't know anything about Star Wars, it's on Disney Plus, but Andor is a good one to watch. It's intense though. It's the most intense of any of them. It's the only one I don't have my nieces and nephews watch right now. But somebody behind the scenes did their work on what resistance movements are like. As somebody who wrote a dissertation set in 1930s France and was following some people's stories into the 40s, like, yeah, it's intense.
Well, I have a last question for you.
Mm-hmm.
And apart from George Lucas, who were the people who really motivated you to work in your field right now? And if you had some people to think of who really counted in your career, who would it be and why?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of folks that I could name here. So the big caveat is this is what's popping in my head in this moment. And if I don't mention you, it's just because my brain is not great on the spot sometimes. I think about the fact that like I would not have the job I have or be doing what I'm doing if it wasn't for Andrew Dell'Antonio. I know he's been on your show before. He tends to undersell the role that he has in our community because it's one that's a little hard to put on CVs. But when I first started needing to use a cane all the time, I've got my cane today. Normally I've got a rollator or crutches. Whatever my body wants to do that day. But when I first needed to use it came and I realized that I couldn't hide my disabilities anymore. I experienced a lot of ableism in graduate school. I'm still processing that. Um, there are news articles about some of my professors in graduate school. I'll leave it there. But I experienced a lot. And when I realized I couldn't hide it anymore, then the question came up of like, what do you want to say? And as an autistic person, I have a hard time lying or even telling half truths. Like it's all or nothing with me usually. Um, but I also didn't know what the implications would be. And I reached out to Andrew Dell'Antonio because I noticed that he was also friends with Amy Sequenza, who's an incredibly important non-speaking autistic person. Um, Amy's work is so, so important. I cannot emphasize that enough. But I thought that was odd. I'm like, there's a musicologist here. What is going on? So I reached out to Andrew and he met up with me. I think it was AMS in Rochester. I was on medical leave, but I was with family in upstate New York. So I went. And not only did he introduce me to like a network of neurodivergent academics, so not just autistics, but also people with ADHD, other things, many of whom are not out publicly or they're out about other identities, so they can't take the hit for being out about everything, right? Me being out as an autistic person is rough. I don't want people to ever come out because they think that they should. You don't owe anyone anything. Like your safety and well-being is the most important. I can be out because I'm a white cishet woman. That's why I can be out. I had some privilege to, leverage. But anyway, Andrew introduced me to a lot of people who told me the truth. I learned the good, the bad, the ugly. I was pretty prepared, I will say, when I made the decision to be open about this and to do this work. Because to me, it's also really important that if you're doing disability work, you don't need to share everything about yourself, but you do need to share your relationship to the community because that's an important way for us to understand and evaluate what you're saying. Like it's just a really important piece of the puzzle. So yeah, Andrew helped me think through all of those things for a very long period of time. And without him, I either wouldn't have been out and working in disability, or I might have done it very wrong. It might have been a more dangerous. I wouldn't have been prepared. I wouldn't have felt like I had a network. And to this day, he's still just an incredibly essential part of my support system. And I'm very, very grateful for him. And his work also helped me understand what I wanted to do with pedagogy in the classroom. He's been very encouraging of a lot of my adventures. I did make him play D&D at least once. He played when he was a kid, but yeah, I brought it back. So I think that it's hard to underestimate like how important that was. I think about everyone who has been or is in disability culture at the University of Michigan. This is an organization that kind of like ramped. I wasn't in it at the very beginning, but I was there very near the beginning. And there are so many folks at DC at UM, Luke Kudrashov, Jeffrey Edelstein, Ashley Wiseman, Solomon Furious Worlds, best name ever. Just so many people that I met through that organization and working together who taught me, like the first time I learned what disability justice was, it was from them. The first time I learned to be comfortable explaining my access needs or what access intimacy was, it was them. And they're fantastic Halloween parties. And yeah, so that was really, really important. And even today, folks like Ashley Shue, for example, here at Virginia Tech, I don't know that I would have lasted without her. I mean, I had long phone call with her this morning, and I'm sure we'll be texting all day. And she is marvelous, and yeah, I owe her a lot. I think I wouldn't have gotten involved with Ramped if not for Galen Lee. The first time I called her, I was so starstruck. I was trying to book her for an event. It's kind of adorable to think about because now, like, she's one of my first calls after the election. Now it feels like we're comrades in arms, but back then I was terrified of her. Yeah, there's so many folks. And I love that I've gotten to a point where, like, my Open the Gates gaming team, I joked to one of my student workers who is neurodivergent that everyone on my team is neurodivergent. They just don't all know it yet. and then it became a game of trying to spot who knew it. That's probably a bit of an exaggeration, but the fact that I have so many people who are different than me, but just believe me if I need something, and then they're there for it, that think about my access needs in advance. Remember the first time I walked into a room and they turned off the lights that sometimes set off my migraine, and I didn't even know that they knew that. Just all of the little things, like the fact that I have chosen family that will be there. It's just kind of remarkable. Yeah. I should stop naming people because I'm only going to miss more and more of them.
Well, thank you so much for this time
Mhm.
together. It was great conversation. And
Yeah,
I'm sure we're gonna see each other in another one project or another.
I hope so. I'm so excited that you're doing this because I think ArtsAbly is really helping connect people and fill this gap that everybody has talked about, but nobody's done something about. So I'm really glad that you're doing it. And yeah, thank you for the opportunity and your persistence, even as my schedule just kept saying no. I'm glad that you kept saying yes until we can make it work.
Thank you. And
Thanks.
yeah, have a great day and talk soon.
Awesome. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.